Okay, in this very brief lecture, I'm going to be talking about foreign policy. But I want to start off with sort of a philosophical thought discussion about how democracy and foreign policy might be hard to reconcile. With democracy, we think about transparency in our government, that the people have access to all the information so that the people can make decisions and support policies that would be beneficial to us domestically, and in this case, abroad with foreign policy. But national security often requires a certain level of secrecy. So, for example, in the capturing and killing of Osama bin Laden, nobody in the country really knew about that. I mean, of course, there were people in the military, President Obama, his advisors, they were in the know, but that was not something, on CNN broadcast that, hey, we think we are close and we're going to go get them. Even the Pakistani government did not have the intelligence to know that this was going to be something the United States was going to come in and essentially illegally do. And that kind of secrecy was probably a big part of why it was successful. So foreign policy requires a level of secrecy that just doesn't jive with democracy. Additionally, democracy tends to take a while. Democracy requires that people are informed, people are able to participate, people are able to discuss and debate and deliberate, and all of that is very lengthy time-wise, and often foreign policy, especially when it comes to national security, is going to involve quick decision-making to be effective. So just food for thought that there might be, it might be hard to reconcile having a country founded on democratic principles with maintaining national security. And it's not just the United States that struggles with this. It would also be, any other democracy in the country. And then you could think of recently the NSA information that was leaked by Edward Snowden. So we think about our democracy, our freedoms, our right to privacy, and how those don't always connect, or at least there is a disconnect in many places when it comes to protecting us and national security. So I have just a few broad topics to introduce. So I have just a few topics for foreign policy. Okay, so there is a constitutional ambiguity when it comes to military powers. On the left here, you can see powers actually given to Congress in the enumerated powers. Congress can declare war, Congress has power of the purse, they can raise the military, they regulate commerce with other nations. We see concrete congressional powers on the left as mandated by the Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution lists things about the executive branch, including a variety of powers. But you'll notice this list, it doesn't look all so powerful. The president is commander-in-chief. He can direct our troops. He can determine goals and strategies when we use force. So he has, in actuality, the power to make war. Congress declares the war, the president makes war, and this has led to a lot of confusion. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has not stepped in to sort of clarify this division of power, and the Supreme Court probably will not. It's an incredibly political question, and the Supreme Court is reluctant to settle these kinds of disputes that maybe the framers intended there to be this kind of constant tension and dispute. The president can appoint ambassadors, so those are people that are also going to be sort of on his diplomacy team to maintain our relationships. And he can negotiate treaties. All of that he needs Senate approval for. Not written here are some of the things that the president can do and we accept to be something he can do, but they're not exactly constitutionally explained. For example, the president could go make an agreement with another world leader and agree on it and just not bring it home to the Senate to approve. In that case, it's still an agreement, and he can still, as commander-in-chief, honor that agreement. And we call that an executive agreement. In that case, though, it does not have the force of law, meaning when the president leaves office, it's not still standing. But generally, the next president line would maintain that executive agreement, but there is no obligation to do so. So a treaty is going to always be your best option as far as a long-standing relationship and agreement with another country. Another thing I want to point out with this confusing delineation of powers is that this is what the War Powers Resolution sought to address. It sought to address this division of power and clarify once and for all that Congress really does have most of the war powers. So the War Powers Resolution does require the president to check in before the deployment of troops. However, if it is a crisis, he can deploy troops and then within 60 days get Congress's approval. So the War Powers Resolution was seeking to shift power away from the executive back to the legislative branch, where maybe the framers thought it should sit. Has that been effective? Many can debate it. I would say it has not been really effective. That power still resides with the president when it comes to war matters. But it does, at least in writing, explain that the president does need to check in with Congress. But if he doesn't, there really is no penalty. Part of the War Powers Resolution did allow, the third part allowed for Congress to essentially call troops back. But the Supreme Court struck that down in 1983, saying there is no legislative veto, that the Congress can't veto a president's action as commander-in-chief. And finally, Congress might have the rhetoric of wanting this power and wanting to limit the executive powers. However, in times of crisis, this country, including Congress, are very eager to look to one person to unify us, to make swift decisions, and so Congress is generally supportive of the president's use of troops, especially if the president has already deployed them, and if any American lives have yet been lost, then Congress, many members of Congress, are to continue to support our troops and support our president in that decision. When we think about presidential power in general, in this country, we tend to think of the president as extremely powerful. Congress, at least, certainly would say that the president's power has augmented greatly, and that's not just been a recent phenomenon, but it has been growing and growing and growing since the 1950s. Internationally, a lot of other countries might say our president is actually quite weak compared to how their executive might be. Okay, so our final topic has to do with foreign policy and what instruments we have in our tool belt. So there's kind of three ways. Move my face here. Kind of three tools we have in our tool belt when it comes to dealing with foreign policy. And you see them listed here: military, economic, and diplomatic. So the last resort is the use of military force. So really, war and threat of war are a powerful tool, but they're one that we don't want to use first. That's the last option. The first option we want to use is diplomacy, developing relationships, keeping open communication, and fostering goodwill internationally. The step in the middle would be maybe the use of economic sanctions. So why it's in the middle? Well, it's not a threat of war and it's not war, so it doesn't have that violence to it. But it is quite a big step beyond diplomacy and just keeping up an open dialogue. Economic sanctions can be extremely harsh, depending on how many sanctions and what kind of sanctions, and if those sanctions are unilateral or multilateral. So an economic sanction is it refers to trade barriers or restrictions on financial transactions. And the United States, if it wants to essentially punish another country for a behavior but doesn't want to use military force, can start these economic sanctions. That would be unilaterally. And we can also work with our friends that we have good diplomatic ties with on a multilateral set of sanctions. Now, if it's multilateral, it's going to be more effective at essentially economically strangling the other country that we're trying to get to change. We're trying to make the country change behavior. Diplomacy hasn't worked. We're not ready to put troops on the ground or do airstrikes or use violence. So we go with this middle ground, economic sanctions. So I want to really emphasize how painful these economic sanctions can be on another country. It's not just, oh, you're cut off of your allowance for a little bit. It can be quite devastating. So I need you to imagine living in a country where in 1 year you have a 5% decline in real gross domestic product. You have 20% unemployment. So those are people not making money. Those are people with a lot of free time and who are very frustrated and desperate. Then you also have a country that was dependent on its daily oil exports, and because of restrictions, trade restrictions, 1.4 million barrels drop in your daily exports. Also, your country has a lot of money abroad. $80 billion trapped abroad that is not coming back into your country. 25% rise in inflation and 40% decline in motor vehicle production. So this all happened in a year in a country that we have really, really tough economic sanctions on. Pause it here while you make your guess what country we would have these sanctions on. And this is Iran. So what I want to demonstrate here is these economic sanctions are a domestic penalty. The civilian population in a country will feel these. And so perhaps the hope is that while it puts a lot of strain on the civilian population in that country, that civilian population also puts a pressure on its own government to make these changes, or the government eventually succumbs to change the behavior, to do what we'd like them to do, and then we will lift these sanctions and they will be able to recover economically. So that is foreign policy. You got 3 tools in our tool belt: diplomatic means, economic means, military means, and then we also discussed the division of power or ambiguity in the division of power between Congress and the President with regards to powers in foreign policy. Okay.